Now, The Dark Side of the Moon was recorded between May of 1972 and January of 1973. Shortly after, on March 1st of 1973, it was released. You know, when I come to think of it, one of my very favorite Led Zeppelin albums may have suffered as far as sales and acceptance because of the release of this album. This album, by this band, is an artistic masterpiece, and I believe an artistic masterpiece in every sense of the word, and we're going to discuss why. Their original leader and main concept director, Syd Barrett, losing interest in the band. That's when they hired David Gilmour, really to do nothing more than to play guitar whenever Syd decided not to perform at a scheduled concert. His presence diminished further and further along those lines, David Gilmour taking a more active role, and eventually you had the four members that we see on The Dark Side of the Moon. But you know, it wasn't just losing a member at this point. That member wasn't lost to him being thrown out of the band or anything. That member was lost due to mental illness. And you know, it's by no means a small wonder that many of Pink Floyd's songs explore the darkest corners of mental illness, for sure. First, when I heard it, just a damn good rock album, right? Oh man, and such a gloss to it. And man, you could just tell it was recorded at Abbey Road Studios. And I'm talking about dynamics, I'm not talking about style. It had a lot of sonic similarities to the magnificent Abbey Road by the Beatles. And we've already discussed how this album was started. First of all, the loss of Syd Barrett. And I do want to bring out another thing here. With the exception of a couple, maybe 3 tracks here, these aren't necessarily Pink Floyd's very best songs ever, but there are at least 3 songs on this album that are amongst their very best. I'll concede that. But you know, it's because it has fewer songs and longer pieces in between that draws attention to those songs. You almost have to take some of these tracks together. Now, I'm going to try and do a breakdown on each track, but I may mention from time to time similarities between this track and that one, and how one track placed properly in the mix and edited properly on this album could take a pretty damn good song and make it into a great song. We'll discuss some of those aspects as well. But you know, in between the time period, Syd Barrett left the band and they started recording this in May of 1972. The band started questioning themselves a bit. They were gradually bringing down their very long pieces into shorter pieces, and they had even developed a suite of this, evidently recorded prior to the proper recordings in May. So all of these things were happening with the band, right? There's a definite band decision to shorten their pieces a bit at this point. And at this point, the band members are interested in the very latest tech, right down to their drummer. The first track being his particular pet project. It introduces the entire album. So Pink Floyd at this point was experimenting with new sounds, modifying their whole approach, shortening their approach. Not always. They would still have longer tracks, but there would have to be a good reason why that track was longer, always from this point on. So if you think the band almost seemed fated to produce a fantastic album, you're probably right. But you know what? It didn't stop there. They had access to Abbey Road Studios, 16-track Abbey Road studio, along with the same ultra-clean transistor-driven boards that gave the Beatles their last magnificent album sound, Abbey Road. That's that gloss, all recorded without tubes. Now just think of what that offers. They're interested in sounding different. Here is the one studio in England that sounds different. But it doesn't stop there, guys. You see, the band was interested at this point in a portable little expensive device. It was called the EMS VCS3, the first truly portable synthesizer. Now, the only weakness for this type of synthesizer is it staying in tune because it's based on an oscillating current and it didn't keep tune real well. But with some finagling, when it was necessary, they were able to tame the beast. And on top of that, they were looking for sounds that didn't necessarily have to be right in tune. They were trying to create colors with this new wonderful instrument at their disposal. You know, you've heard me say one of my favorite DVDs was a film I went to go see shortly after Let It Be was released. I was about 16 or 17 years old when Pink Floyd's movie Live at Pompeii came out. I don't think that was the original title, but that's what they're calling it these days. You know, I went and saw that movie dozens of times. But anyway, what was wonderful in that movie is there's footage of them dealing with these synthesizers there and actively trying to create the sounds of what would become the sound of The Dark Side of the Moon. Now, it's by this time, the band has been around a while. They've got their groupies, and they're living their lives a bit on the edge here at this point, right? As a matter of fact, as evidence in with some of Waters' lyrics, certainly, they're even starting to question this early whether this is really a healthy lifestyle to begin with. And of course, as a group, they're going to explore the darkness of at least dysfunctionality, if not outright mental illness. It's all there, and it's right there in the title of the album, folks, with Dark Side of the Moon being analogous to losing your mind, right? And those elements are all on this album, don't get me wrong, but there's also concern with the amount of time we have on this planet. How do we balance ourselves in this modern world? Those things we want and desire versus the things we perhaps shouldn't try to investigate, right? Now, the writers on this album, this to me is Pink Floyd perfectly mixed as far as who writes how many songs per album. If they could have stayed with this structure, I can't even contemplate just how great their albums would have been from this point on. Here we see Waters responsible for writing 5 of these tunes. Nick Mason is responsible for writing 3 of these tunes. And David Gilmour and Richard Wright are both responsible for being co-writers or writers of 4 tunes each. There is almost for the first time, and perhaps the last time in Pink Floyd's career, a democratic approach to recording an album. And I think it's one of the strengths on this album, as well as a couple of more circumstances that just went their way. And only one of those circumstances was they kind of inherited Alan freaking Parsons as their engineer. So exactly what did they inherit with Alan Parsons? Well, he was the assistant engineer on some of the recordings for Let It Be and almost all the recordings on Abbey Road. You know, in my opinion, Alan Parsons is not only one of the best engineers in rock, he'd be in or very near to my top 10, maybe comfortably in there actually, the more I think about it. You know, in an interview with Alan Parsons, he once said that he played the master tapes for this album prior to release to Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney listened to it intently and he asked him, "So what do you think?" Paul's response was, "Ask for a percentage." Paul knew on first listen that this was going to be a monster. And as I stated in my last video, in my opinion, it is their very best album they ever recorded. Not that following albums weren't brilliant, mind you. And, of course, there were a couple of brilliant albums before. All right, track 1, Speak to Me. Primarily a Nick Mason composition and the shortest track on the album. But you know, what an important piece this is. This sets up the entire album and is really part 1 of a 3-part suite that blends into the rest of the album. The spoken words in this small part, these sentiments are echoed throughout the album. Wonderful. And the first sounds we hear are that of a heartbeat, and it gets louder. And really, what is a heartbeat? That is our timepiece ticking away, right? And that heartbeat gets louder on this track and we start hearing things intermixed with it, and we feel like we're being woken up. And really, with the words of the next track, we understand that this is an awakening here. Not only is this person pondering whether he could possibly be mad, insane, but also there's an awareness of his own timepiece ticking away, getting louder. Here we see interspersed with possibly cash registers, definitely some one-armed bandits. We are also introduced to sounds that we would hear later on in the album for a totally different suite of songs. Of course, I'm talking about Money, and we'll get to that in a moment. And all of this occurs in just a mere 1 minute and 4 seconds. Now this piece blends into the next track, Time. Here we hear what was once a heartbeat morph in to the ticking of many timepieces, don't we? And they finally blend into the tick-tock, tick-tock of a metronome. And you know, I just love this whole concept. We go from a flesh and blood heartbeat to the ticking analog timepieces, and finally to a computerized metronome. Isn't that just wonderful? You just knew, first time listening, you were into something you've never heard before. Then we hear Waters' ominous bass, don't we? A very ominous bass line. And you know, when I listen to this, I hear Richard Wright's keyboards almost representing different days or different experiences, slightly to the left and right of that ominous bass. And you know, when I first heard this bass line, I felt like it was almost like a fist against a wall. And you know, it's with the lyrics of this song that we finally realize that all of these sound effects, all of the instrumentation that we've heard up to this point is actually representing a young person, someone who perhaps is even still in their teens or very early 20s, realizing that the life that they've lived for the last 5 or 6 years as a teenager has to change. There are even lyrics bemoaning the fact that maybe it might be too late, that you missed the starting gun. But you know what? To my ears, it is David Gilmour who is the primary instrument that really stands out on this track. His guitar lines, once I knew what this album was about, they became in my head almost like nails in a coffin, with special effects to almost give his guitar a real icy kind of sound. And you know, this is one of the very best tracks on the album. And one of the reasons for that is it's written by all 4 members of the band. Now the next song, The Great Gig in the Sky, began as one of Wright's keyboard progression pieces, but they asked the magnificent Claire Torrey to sit in as a guest vocalist, and she would just vamp. What amazing vocal vamping this is. It's done so well that she gets a co-songwriting credit for this song. It's with that vamping that basically she creates the piece's melody. Now the song really had 2 original titles. They would either call it the Religion Song, or more appropriately, they called it the Mortality Sequence. You know, when I read that, I felt vindicated, because I always thought this whole album is talking about basically mortality and how much time do we put to various aspects of our lives. But you know, I also hear a real sadness here. This is someone who is in mourning, and it makes you wonder, is this someone who has passed on and is now in a heavenly position, mourning for us here on earth? I know, Michael reading into things again, but I can't help but think that that is exactly what's going on here, especially when you take into consideration the lyrics interspersed throughout this album. The album almost represents to me a mournful awakening to the fact that we only have so much time to get ourselves together, to live, and to live well. But notice Wright's keyboard toward the end, there's a warble to it, and then the song's final declaration, I never said I was afraid of dying. And it makes you wonder, is this a statement in defiance of death, or just wishful thinking. Now it's with the next track, Money, that Pink Floyd starts to address some of the things that can get in our way as we live our lives. Only one such thing: money. Now this song, for the most part, is played in 7/8 time. It slips into 4/4 time, and from what I heard, mainly because David Gilmour was having trouble nailing a solo that was fitting in 7/8 time. And so they decided at that point they would slip into 4/4 time, and it added something extra to the song as well. And man, what a wonderful up front, right in your face guitar solo that is. It's with this song that Pink Floyd is no longer hinting. They're making a statement of just how much of a trap money can be for anyone who will do anything for it. And they're not talking about a lot of money. They're talking about a whole lot of money here. You know, the kind of money that buys you a Learjet or a football team. The sax work on this song is magnificent. And you know what? I remember a time on radio, they played a version of this that just snipped out the word bullshit. And of course, when this was released as a single, it was a monster hit for the band, and it even drove further sales of this amazing album. And you know, the key to this song is that 7/8 bass line, unwavering, unnerving. The next song, Brain Damage, fully introduces us to lunacy or madness, doesn't it? And if the dam breaks open many years too soon, and if there's no room on the hill. Wonderful lyrics. Is he talking about getting caught up in all the wrong things at the point when you die and there's no redemption for your soul? Or is he talking about lunacy? Well, he does speak of the lunatics in his hall, the hallway to his own room. And these lunatics are folded up in a paper, face down to the floor. You know, when I read this, I go, oh, it's his paper being delivered. And this song is reflecting all of the bad news that just seeps into his house no matter what he does. Is it the real crazies of the world that he's talking about here, like mass murderers? No, I believe this is a song directly to Syd Barrett. And I think the key part here is if the band you're playing in plays another tune. This is to Syd. Alright, so the next song, Eclipse, is more a refrain than anything else. And it mentions everything under the sun in this song. All that you fight, all that you feel, all of the things that we experience in life, whether it's for the good or the bad, if everything under the sun is in tune, that powerful sun can still be eclipsed by the moon. And of course, this statement really makes it clear. There's just a thin veil between sanity and insanity, and we should be very careful how we tread our paths in life. Next song up, one of the most beautiful Pink Floyd songs, Breathe. You know, this song brings out that any longevity that we might have, anyone who lives a long life, is basically for those who heed the tide. But for those who are willing to take chances in life, there are highs to experience, but there are sudden pitfalls as well. Of course, this song blends into another connecting piece, but dig what they say at the end of this sound collage. They actually give an answer to the question the last song asks, where the narrator declares, "Live for today, gone tomorrow, that's me." And if there is a final declaration to this album, it's interesting. I think it's here. And as I said in my last video, they actually, in their lyrics, question their very lifestyle. But here, evidently, Pink Floyd is saying they're gonna go with it. Next up, the magnificent Us and Them. Forward, he cried, from the rear, and the front rank died. You know, when this song came out, that was a bit too familiar to us young listeners. You know, these words just say it all. And you know what? That was a hot topic when this album came out. Young people were questioning for the first time the whole idea of going to war, actually believing that we could achieve peace in our lifetime. Now, of course, this leads us to the last track, doesn't it? And you know what? This track is full of just wonderful keyboard parts, But once again, we hear David Gilmour and his guitar again. Sounds almost like icicles against this magnificent ending piece. The moment it ends, it begs you to turn that record back over to side A and start it all over again.